Demetrius Terrence Frazier stands at the crossroads of his own dark history. The weight of his actions and the shadow of his fate closing in with each passing moment. With his execution scheduled, the question lingers, can a man truly change, or is he forever defined by the crimes that sealed his destiny? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more. Demetrius Terrence Frazier, born on October 29, 1972, is an American convicted murderer and serial sexual assault offender currently on death row in Alabama. He was sentenced to death for the 1991 sexual assault and murder of 40-year-old Pauline Brown during a robbery on November 27, 1991. Frazier confessed to Brown's murder following his arrest in Detroit, Michigan, for the 1992 killing of 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick, whom he shot to death while attempting to sexually assault her. In addition to his 2 murder convictions, Frazier was suspected of sexually assaulting 8 other women in Michigan and was convicted of 2 of those sexual assaults by a Wayne County jury. In 1996, Frazier was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in Alabama for the killing of Pauline Brown. Before that, in 1993, he received multiple life sentences in Michigan for the murder of Crystal Kendrick and other offenses. He spent over 18 years incarcerated at the Alger Correctional Facility in Michigan before being transferred in 2011 to Alabama's Holman Correctional Facility, home to the state's death row. Frazier is currently scheduled for execution by nitrogen hypoxia on February 6, 2025. Between 1991 and 1992, Demetrius Terrence Frazier, then 19 years old, had committed 2 murders in Michigan and Alabama respectively. On the night of November 27, 1991, in Birmingham, Alabama, Demetrius Terrence Frazier found himself walking through a quiet residential area when he passed a ground-floor apartment. As he casually glanced toward the building, his attention was drawn to a light glowing inside the apartment. This seemingly insignificant detail sparked a dangerous thought in Frazier's mind, the opportunity to commit robbery. Frazier, then 19 years old, decided to act on his impulse. He removed the screen from the window of the apartment and slipped inside. Once inside, Frazier began to search the apartment, rummaging through drawers and cabinets. His search yielded only $10 in cash, a small sum that didn't satisfy his desires. He then moved to another room, where he found 40-year-old Pauline Starks Brown peacefully asleep in her bed. Startled by Frazier's intrusion, Brown awoke to the sight of a man standing over her. In a panic, Frazier demanded more money from her. Terrified, Brown handed over $80, hoping it would appease her attacker. However, Frazier's demands didn't stop there. He threatened her with a gun and, in an act of cold cruelty, forced Brown into a terrifying encounter. Despite her pleas for mercy, Brown was violently assaulted at gunpoint. After the assault, Frazier fired a shot, likely to intimidate or silence her. He briefly left the apartment, stepping outside to check whether anyone had heard the gunshot. Upon returning, Frazier found that Brown had died from her injuries. However, his indifference to her death was chilling. Frazier proceeded to search the apartment one last time for anything of value, before helping himself to some food. With no regard for the life he had just taken, he left the apartment, taking care to dispose of the weapon used in the crime. The discovery of Pauline Brown's body came the following day when her coworker and close friend, Tyrone Mitchell, became concerned after Brown failed to show up for work. They had planned for Mitchell to receive a ride from Brown, but her absence was unsettling. Mitchell, worried about her whereabouts, decided to visit her apartment. Along with 2 maintenance workers, he managed to open the window to Brown's apartment, allowing them to look inside. What they found was nothing short of horrifying. Inside the apartment, Brown's lifeless body was discovered face down in the bedroom. She had been murdered in the most horrific of circumstances. At the time of her death, Pauline Brown left behind 2 daughters and a grandchild, who had been born just weeks before her tragic demise. The loss of a mother and grandmother was felt deeply by her family, as they mourned her untimely death and the horrific manner in which she was taken from them. The brutal murder of Pauline Brown would ultimately be a key turning point in the investigation into Frazier's crimes, which would eventually lead to his conviction and death sentence. The city of Detroit, Michigan, was shaken by a horrific crime on March 8, 1992. On that day, a young girl named Crystal Kendrick became the victim of a brutal murder during a sexual assault attempt. Her life, already marked by hardship, was tragically cut short. Crystal, a runaway, found herself confined within the walls of an abandoned house at the hands of her assailant, Demetrius Frazier. As he attempted to sexually assault her, Crystal desperately fought for her life, trying to escape the terrifying situation. In a cruel twist of fate, her flight ended in tragedy when Frazier shot her in the head. Crystal's lifeless body was discovered with a single bullet wound, a stark reminder of the violence she endured. Those who knew her remembered a different Crystal, a well-behaved girl before circumstances beyond her control altered the course of her life. The abandonment by her mother, coupled with her mother's struggles with drug addiction, left Crystal without the guidance and support she desperately needed. As a result, she gradually drifted astray, lacking the supervision of a stable home environment. The guardians who had tried to provide Crystal with a home were left with profound guilt and sorrow. Regretting that they couldn't offer her the consistent care and support that might have changed her path. Their grief echoed the wider tragedy of a young life lost too soon. The authorities quickly identified Demetrius Frazier as the prime suspect in Crystal's murder, placing him on their wanted list. However, Frazier remained at large, evading capture until he committed yet another heinous crime later that same month. It was only after the murder of his second victim that Frazier was apprehended. Upon his arrest, Frazier confessed to both murders while in police custody in Michigan. His confession brought a chilling end to the case, revealing the dark actions of a predator who had terrorized the streets of Detroit. The tragic story of Crystal Kendrick serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerability of young people and the devastating consequences of violence. On July 9, 1992, Frazier was officially charged with first-degree murder in the brutal shooting death of Crystal Kendrick. Along with the murder charge, he was also implicated in a series of other heinous crimes, including the sexual assaults of 8 additional women. These charges placed a heavy burden on the public's perception of Frazier, who had already garnered attention for his violent criminal history. Before Frazier's trial for the murder of Kendrick commenced, he and his defense attorneys made a bold attempt to have his confession to the killing dismissed as inadmissible in court. Frazier claimed that he had been manipulated into confessing to the murders of both Crystal Kendrick and Pauline Brown. He argued that he had fallen in love with the lead homicide detective on his case, Monica Childs, a seasoned officer from Detroit who had been working relentlessly on the investigation. Frazier contended that Childs had tricked him into confessing by promising that he would not be sent back to Alabama to stand trial for the murder of Pauline Brown, a crime he was also accused of. According to Frazier's defense team, Childs had reportedly assured him that he would not face the death penalty in Michigan, as the state did not practice capital punishment. Unlike Alabama, where he could face execution if convicted. Despite these claims, the courts ultimately dismissed Frazier's allegations, finding no merit in his defense. As a result, the confession was ruled admissible, and it became a central piece of evidence against him during his trial. Tensions were high during the proceedings, and at one point, Frazier reportedly became so enraged that he physically attacked one of the prosecutors in court. This outburst further cemented the volatile nature of his character, highlighting his aggressive tendencies and disregard for authority. On April 8, 1993, after a lengthy and contentious trial, a Michigan court found Frazier guilty of felony murder in the case of Crystal Kendrick's death. He was also convicted of felony firearms possession, a charge stemming from the illegal weapon he had used in the shooting. The court sentenced Frazier to 2 consecutive life terms in prison for the 2 charges, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars without the possibility of parole. In addition to the murder charge, Frazier faced separate trials for a string of violent crimes committed before Kendrick's death. One of the most notable cases was an armed robbery, along with 2 sexual assaults that occurred on September 1, 1991. These were just some of the many offenses that Frazier was connected to during his criminal career. On October 20, 1993, after another trial, Frazier was handed an additional 2 life sentences, along with a sentence of 60 to 90 years in prison for the sexual assault and robbery offenses. The multiple life sentences and extensive prison time solidified Frazier's status as a notorious criminal who would never again see freedom. In November 1993, Frazier was indicted by a Jefferson County jury in Alabama on charges of capital murder for the brutal death of Pauline Brown. Alabama, unlike Michigan, had a legal system that allowed for the death penalty to be imposed in capital murder cases, which meant that Frazier faced the very real possibility of execution if convicted. This distinction in legal practices between the 2 states added a heightened level of tension to the case, as Frazier's fate was now in the hands of a jury that could decide whether he would live or die. The trial began in earnest, and on June 5, 1996, after a lengthy and intense deliberation, Frazier was found guilty of one count of capital murder. The jury concluded that the murder occurred under the aggravating circumstances of robbery, a key element in establishing the severity of the crime. In addition, Frazier was convicted of a lesser charge of murder during the course of a sexual assault, which further solidified his reputation as a dangerous and violent offender. However, the proceedings were not without drama. Just before the jury's verdict was delivered, Frazier reportedly erupted in anger, making inflammatory accusations against the jury. In a fit of rage, Frazier threw a pen at the jurors, a brazen act of defiance that reflected his deep frustration with the justice system. His outburst only served to underline the volatile nature of his character and his apparent lack of remorse for the crimes he had committed. 2 days later, on June 7, 1996, a sentencing hearing was held, where the jury was tasked with recommending an appropriate punishment. After carefully considering the evidence and the circumstances of the crime, the jury voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty for the capital murder charge. This recommendation reflected the severity of Frazier's actions and the impact they had on the victim's family and the community as a whole. In a statement following the verdict, Curtis Starks, Pauline Brown's brother, expressed a sense of relief and closure for his family. He made it clear that, while nothing could ever bring back his sister, the conviction of Frazier brought some measure of justice. Starks stated that Frazier, as a serial rapist and murderer who had taken the lives of innocent people over trivial matters, deserved the harshest punishment possible. He emphasized that Frazier had shown no regard for the lives of others and that, for the sake of justice and safety, he should never again be allowed to roam free. On August 8, 1996, after the jury's recommendation, Circuit Court Judge Honorable Mike McCormick formally sentenced Frazier to death for the charge of capital murder. The sentencing took place during a formal court hearing, marking a somber moment in the long journey to bring justice to the victim and her family. In addition to the death sentence, Frazier was handed a life sentence for the lesser charge of murder in the course of a sexual assault, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life incarcerated for his monstrous crimes. Despite his conviction, Frazier's actions and the brutality of his offenses left a lasting scar on the community and the families of his victims. From 1993 to 2011, Demetrius Frazier served his life sentence at the Alger Maximum Correctional Facility in Michigan, under the strict supervision of the Michigan Department of Corrections. His time there was marked by the passage of years spent in a maximum security facility, where he remained confined, facing the consequences of his violent actions. However, in 2011, after nearly 2 decades, Frazier was transferred to the Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama, where he was placed on death row, awaiting the final outcome of his legal battles. The transition from Michigan to Alabama was a significant one, as it meant that Frazier now faced the prospect of execution in a state where the death penalty remained a legal form of punishment. During his time imprisoned in both states, Frazier engaged in a lengthy series of legal appeals in an attempt to overturn his death sentence for the murder of Pauline Brown, a crime that had led to his conviction in Alabama. His appeals were numerous and drawn out, but despite his persistent legal efforts, they were consistently dismissed by various courts. On January 10, 1999, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals made a ruling that dismissed Frazier's appeal against his death sentence, rejecting any claims he had raised to avoid execution. This decision was a significant blow to Frazier's defense, yet it was far from the end of his legal options. Frazier's legal team continued to fight for his life, and on December 30, 1999, the Alabama Supreme Court issued a ruling that confirmed the death penalty for Frazier. They rejected his follow-up appeal, affirming the judgment of the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals and reaffirming that he would remain on death row, awaiting the finality of his punishment. This decision further solidified the conviction and death sentence against Frazier, making it increasingly clear that his efforts to escape execution were unlikely to succeed. In February 2003, Frazier made another attempt to challenge his death sentence, filing a second appeal to the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals. This appeal was ultimately dismissed on February 28, 2003, as the courts once again upheld his sentence, marking another setback for his defense team. Despite these repeated defeats, Frazier's legal team pressed on, continuing to pursue every possible avenue of appeal in an effort to save him from the lethal injection that awaited him on death row. As Frazier's years on death row wore on, he continued to fight for his life through the legal system. On October 25, 2011, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals also dismissed an appeal filed by Frazier, effectively shutting down another potential avenue for relief. Then, on October 1, 2012, the United States Supreme Court denied Frazier's request for relief, fully exhausting his regular appeals process. This ruling left Frazier with little recourse, as he had now exhausted the typical legal pathways for challenging his death sentence. In September 2014, the Alabama Attorney General's office filed a motion with the Alabama Supreme Court, requesting that execution dates be set for 9 death row inmates in the state, including Frazier. The motion came after the state successfully amended its laws to approve a new lethal injection protocol. This change was a significant development, as it meant that Alabama had found a way to potentially move forward with executions that had been delayed for various reasons. In response to this, Frazier, along with several other death row inmates, filed a federal lawsuit challenging the state's new execution protocols and the use of lethal injection, which was Alabama's primary method of execution. This lawsuit, which was heard in 2015 and 2016, was part of a larger debate about the ethical and legal implications of lethal injection as a method of execution. As part of the legal challenges, Frazier and fellow condemned inmate Tommy Arthur suggested that their executions be carried out by alternative methods, such as hanging or firing squad. These suggestions, however, were rejected by a federal judge, who ruled that such methods were not constitutionally acceptable. Tommy Arthur, who was convicted of the 1982 contract killing of Troy Wicker, was eventually executed in 2017, but Frazier's case continued to be tied up in legal battles. In 2015, Frazier was one of 5 death row prisoners who filed a lawsuit opposing the state authorities' use of midazolam, a sedative that was part of a controversial 3-drug protocol used in lethal injections. This legal action sought to challenge the method and raise questions about its potential to cause unnecessary suffering. In 2018, the Alabama state legislature passed a law that legalized the use of nitrogen hypoxia as an alternative method of execution. This new form of execution, which involved the inhalation of nitrogen gas, was touted as a more humane alternative to lethal injection. As a result, Frazier was among the death row inmates who chose to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia when the state moved forward with this method of execution. Despite these new developments, Frazier's legal battles continued. On October 9, 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court dismissed Frazier's final appeal against his death sentence, leaving him with no remaining legal recourse. Frazier was one of 6 condemned inmates in Alabama who lost their last appeals on that date, further solidifying the reality that his execution was drawing nearer. The prolonged and complex legal saga that Frazier had navigated over nearly 2 decades had ultimately failed to prevent his execution, marking the culmination of years of legal maneuvering, court rulings, and challenges to Alabama's death penalty procedures. In late 2024, a significant development occurred in the case of Demetrius Frazier, as a formal request was made for his death warrant to be issued. This request marked the beginning of the final phase in his lengthy and tumultuous legal journey. On January 7, 2025, in response to the request, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey, following an order from the Alabama Supreme Court, made the decisive move to schedule Frazier's execution. The date was set for February 6, 2025, marking a grim milestone in Frazier's years of legal battles and delays. The court's authorization provided the legal framework for the governor to set a definitive execution date, and with that, Frazier's fate was sealed. Frazier was to become the 4th individual to be executed by the state of Alabama using nitrogen gas inhalation, a method that had been recently introduced as an alternative to lethal injection. Alabama had already carried out its first 3 nitrogen gas executions in 2024, with Kenneth Eugene Smith being executed in January, Alan Eugene Miller in September, and Kerry Dale Grayson in November. These executions marked a new chapter in Alabama's death penalty practices, as the state was one of the first to utilize nitrogen gas as a method of execution, following legal challenges and concerns over the use of lethal injection drugs. The state established a 30-hour window for the execution of Frazier, setting it between midnight on February 6 and 6 a.m. on February 7, 2025. This time frame provided the authorities with a designated period in which to carry out the execution, but the exact moment would remain uncertain until the final hours. The window allowed for flexibility in the execution process, ensuring that everything was in place for the procedure to be carried out within this time span. As the clock ticks closer to the execution date, the tension surrounding Frazier's fate is mounted, with the eyes of the state and the nation focused on the first full-scale execution by nitrogen hypoxia in Alabama. For Frazier, who had spent years on death row, the announcement of the execution date brings his long legal battle to a dramatic and final conclusion. His case had been marked by multiple appeals and attempts to challenge both his conviction and the method of his impending execution. As the day draws closer, the families of Frazier's victims, the state's legal community, and death penalty opponents will prepare for the conclusion of a chapter that had stretched over decades. With his execution approaching in February 2025, Demetrius Frazier fights to delay his fate, filing a federal appeal to stop Alabama from using nitrogen hypoxia. His lawyers argue the method is inhumane, citing recent executions where inmates appeared to suffer conscious suffocation and convulsions. They demand changes to Alabama's execution protocol to ensure compliance with constitutional standards. Alabama officials push back, insisting the method is reliable. The case is now before U.S. District Judge Emily Marks, whose ruling could shape the future of nitrogen gas executions. Meanwhile, Frazier's legal team argues he belongs under Michigan's custody, not Alabama's, claiming his transfer was unlawful. They appealed to Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, but Michigan officials reject the request, affirming Frazier's legal transfer. With no support, his team withdraws the appeal. As Alabama prepares to proceed, the case intensifies debate over nitrogen hypoxia and the evolving ethics of capital punishment in the U.S. Amid the legal battles, Frazier's mother, Carol Frazier, made a public appeal for her son's life. She urged Governor Whitmer to intervene and allow her son to serve the remainder of his life sentence in Michigan, rather than face execution in Alabama. Carol Frazier pleaded with the governor, asserting that her son had changed over the years and was no longer the same person who had committed the horrific crimes that led to his conviction. She expressed her belief that her son deserved a chance at redemption and pleaded for his life to be spared, emphasizing her love and hope for a different outcome. Meanwhile, death penalty opponents rallied around Frazier, voicing their strong objections to his upcoming execution. While they acknowledged the severity and brutality of the crimes he had committed, they argued that the use of capital punishment was inherently unjust, both from a philosophical and legal perspective. They pointed to the growing body of evidence against the efficacy and fairness of the death penalty, asserting that the execution of Frazier, along with others in similar circumstances, was a reflection of a broken system. These voices, though not swaying the legal process, added to the chorus of opposition to Alabama's use of the death penalty, underscoring the broader ethical debate surrounding Frazier's case. As Frazier's execution date draws near, the combination of legal maneuvers, public appeals, and ethical arguments reflects the multifaceted nature of his case, highlighting not only the legal complexities of his situation but also the profound emotional and moral questions at the heart of the death penalty debate. Thank you for watching and joining me in this deep dive into the life and story of Demetrius Terrence Frazier. If you found this video compelling, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that challenge our understanding of justice and redemption. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think? Was Frazier's fate inevitable, or could he have changed? Until next time, stay safe and stay curious.